Last week, Minions and Monsters, the latest film in the Despicable Me and Minions franchise, opened in theaters. Now it's time to rank all 7 Despicable Me and Minions movies from the worst to the best. In last place is Minions and Monsters. I'm probably one of the only people over the age of 6 who unironically enjoys most of the Despicable Me and Minions movies. I know these movies are not high art, I know they're silly, they're loud, and they're basically designed to sell merch, but for the most part, I have a good time with this franchise. I like these movies, and I think the first Minions movie was fun, and even when they're a bit dumb, they're usually dumb but charming. So when I say this is definitely the weakest of the 7 films, you better know that I'm talking about. This movie is not awful or painful or some cinematic disaster, but it is absolutely one that made me sit there and ask, who on earth is the audience for this? Because the biggest problem for the movie is that it's not unwatchable. The biggest problem is that it feels like it was just made for an audience that does not exist. The Despicable Me and Minions movies have always been, at their core, spoofs and homages to spy movies, supervillain stories, and heist films. That's why they work. Gru is basically a cartoonish James Bond villain who becomes a dad. Scarlet Overkill is this big theatrical comic book style supervillain. The Anti-Villain League stuff feels like a kid-friendly parody of spy franchises. Even when the movies get a bit ridiculous, they still feel like they belong in the same general genre. This one, though, suddenly decides it wants to be a 1920s Hollywood satire, mixed with references to 100-year-old classic cinema, and I just do not understand that decision at all. It's set in 1920s Hollywood, and it keeps throwing in references to films and film culture from a completely different era. One of the main characters is a parody of Gort from Today the Earth Stood Still, which makes no sense. Because first of all, if the movie is set in the 20s, why is there a character who's a parody of a robot from a movie that didn't come out until the 50s? That's not just a deep cut or obscure, that's an anachronism inside a movie that's already built around its very specific time period. It would be like making a movie set in the 1800s and somebody do a Star Wars reference. You can do it, but why? And second, who's even supposed to get the jokes? Kids obviously are not going to understand references to old Hollywood black and white sci-fi movies from almost 100 years ago. Most parents probably aren't going to get the references either, unless they're classic film buffs or their parents raised them on really old movies. So the whole time I was watching this, I just kept asking, what is the target demographic? Because it's not like the movie is making these references in a way that becomes funny even if you don't understand them. Sometimes that can work, you can reference something obscure, but the joke still lands because the setup itself is funny. Here, a lot of it just feels random. It feels like the movie's elbowing you in the ribs and going, hey, remember Casablanca? And I'm just sitting there like, yeah, I know what Casablanca is, but why are you referencing it in the Minions movie? And that pretty much sums up the whole film. It doesn't feel like it has a clear identity. It feels like 2 completely different movie ideas fused together. On the one side, you've got the Minions doing their usual slapstick chaos, and on the other side, you've got a weird old Hollywood parody full of references that most of the audience is not going to get. And instead of blending those together in a clever way, those 2 halves mostly just sit next to each other awkwardly. Now, to be fair, the Minions are still the Minions. If your kids like them, they'll probably still have a decent time. It's still slapstick and Three Stooges-style chaos, physical comedy, things exploding, characters getting hit in the face, and all the usual stuff that kids tend to laugh at. There are a few moments where I chuckled, and there are some decent background gags, and there are a couple of self-aware jokes about how absurdly profitable the Minions are, which is probably the best part of the movie, because at least that feels honest. Like, yes, thank you, glad we're acknowledging that the Minions are Universal's cash cow, but outside of that, the story is very thin. And not just simple, because there are Minions movies, I mean, it's thin as in there's barely enough material to justify the runtime. The A story is basically just rehashing the first Minions movie. They need to find a boss, and we go through another round of them going from one bad situation to another after a montage of accidentally killing or losing the previous bosses. It's familiar territory, but it's not done in a fun back-to-basics way. It feels more like the writers looked at the first Minions and said, that worked once, let's just do it again, but with old movie references this time. And the B story is basically just, look at how many old movie references we can throw in, and that's it, that's the whole joke. I compare it to Space Jam: A New Legacy, because that movie had the exact same kind of feeling, when the entire point seemed to be, hey audience, look how many recognizable things we own. But the difference is that with Space Jam, Warner Brothers was pulling from a giant library of movies and characters that most audiences at least sort of know. It's got Batman, Superman, The Matrix, Harry Potter, and Looney Tunes, and even though the movie was bad, people at least recognize the IP. This feels like Universal trying to do their own version of that, except they're pulling from a much weirder and much older bag of references. So instead of, hey, remember iconic movies you grew up with, it's more like, remember that one old sci-fi movie your grandpa might have watched and mentioned once or twice? And that's not exactly the strongest hook for a Minions movie in the year 2026. And the weirdest part is the movie doesn't even seem sure how seriously to take its own premise. There's one character where the film never really clarifies whether he's supposed to actually be some kind of robot alien conqueror, or if he's just some delusional weirdo in a cheap costume. And normally ambiguity can be funny if the movie leans into the absurdity, but here it's very underdeveloped, like they couldn't decide what the joke was supposed to be. Is he meant to be a real sci-fi threat, or is he just this actor who's gone insane? Is he a gimmick? It doesn't really say one way or the other, and that becomes a recurring issue in the whole thing. It doesn't commit. It just throws stuff at the wall and hopes the minions screaming will distract from the fact that none of it adds up. Then we get to the villain who's introduced in the third act, who's voiced by Trey Parker, and wow, his voice got old fast. He's doing the same South Park voice he does for everything, and in a Minions movie, it sticks out like a sore thumb. It's funny for like the first minute or two because you recognize his voice, think, oh yeah, Trey Parker, and then after that you realize you have to listen to this for the next 45 minutes, and it becomes incredibly grating. It's one of those performances where the voice is doing so much work to be quirky and eccentric that it loops around from being slightly amusing to just becoming exhausting. And when the villain is introduced that late and isn't especially interesting to begin with, it becomes even more noticeable because there's not much else there. He doesn't feel like a memorable antagonist. He feels like a last-minute obstacle the script needed because it was running out of movie. And that's kind of the point of the whole film. It feels assembled rather than written. It feels like someone had a boardroom pitch that went, okay, people like the Minions and people like movies, let's do Minions in old Hollywood. Throw in some classic film references, slapstick, a random villain, maybe one or two jokes for the adults, and call it a day. Because there's basically nothing here that connects emotionally or thematically to the rest of the franchise. Outside of the few jokes during the credits, there's almost nothing that ties it into the other Despicable Me or Minions movies in any meaningful way. It just feels really detached, like a spin-off of a spin-off. I'm not saying every movie in the franchise needs to have some deep emotional arc about family and belonging, but even the sillier entries usually have some kind of hook. Despicable Me has Gru becoming a dad. The sequel has Gru balancing family life with spy nonsense. The third one has the twin brother dynamic and the whole 80s supervillain thing. And the Minions prequel at least had a clear road trip structure with Scarlet Overkill as the fun villain. This one just exists. There's no message or heart at all. It's not totally devoid of entertainment value, like kids will probably laugh at the slapstick. There are a few clever sight gags. I got a couple of chuckles out of some four jokes, and I will admit, hearing the word bastard used in a Minions movie was absolutely not on my 2026 bingo card. That was one of those moments where my brain had to take a second to process what I just heard. But those little moments aren't enough to save a movie that otherwise just feels so empty and so bizarrely targeted. If you have kids who love the Minions, I'm sure they'll be entertained enough once this is streaming. They'll laugh at the chaos, the noises, the physical comedy, and the fact that little yellow corn pops continue to exist. But as an actual movie, there's nothing here. No clever new angle, no strong story, no memorable villain, no emotional core, no real reason for this to exist outside of the fact that the Minions print money. And that's ultimately what this feels like. A cash grab. Not even a fun cash grab, just a very obvious one. If you were to open the dictionary and flip to the word cash grab, you would see the poster for this movie. So yeah, I didn't hate it. It wasn't miserable, it's mildly amusing in spots, but it's easily the weakest film of this franchise, and one of the clearest examples of a studio making something not because they had a great idea, but because they knew that the name alone would sell tickets. It's certainly a movie, it certainly has a plot, it certainly has characters, it certainly exists. Number 6, Despicable Me 4. The biggest issue with this film was what I call the Iron Man 2 problem, or since we're talking about Illumination movies, I guess the Secret Life of Pets 2 problem. It feels like the writers came up with 5 or 6 different movie ideas, couldn't decide which one to make, and instead tried to cram them all into a single film. We got the main storyline with the Maxime Lamal villain, who's supposed to be the central threat, and then there's an entirely separate plot about 5 minions becoming superheroes after receiving experimental powers, which we kind of already did in the second movie. We already did the mutant minions thing. There's another subplot about a hairstylist who wants revenge on Lucy because of something happened years ago. Then there's Gru being forced to mentor a neighborhood girl who turns becoming a criminal. And on top of that, you've also got Gru adjusting life with his newborn son. None of these stories are terrible on their own, but because the movie keeps bouncing between them every few minutes, none of them get enough time to breathe. It feels less like watching a movie and more like watching a bunch of episodes of a TV show. The pacing really suffers because of this. Just as you're about to get invested in one storyline, the movie jumps to another. By the time it circles back, you almost forgot what was happening before. There's never a strong sense of momentum. The humor is another mixed bag. Some jokes still land, but a lot of them either are psycho gags we've already seen throughout the franchise, or they borrow heavily from other animated movies. Gru's baby is probably the biggest example of that. Nearly every scene involving him reminded me of Jack from The Incredibles. A superpowered baby causing chaos around the house has already been done, and honestly, Pixar did it much better. There are also jokes that feel strangely outdated. At one point, the movie references the Honey Badger Don't Care meme, which was popular over 15 years ago. Instead of feeling nostalgic, it just feels oddly behind the times. Then there's the villain. His motivation is revealed late in the movie, and instead of it being funny or clever, it's mostly confusing. When you finally learn why he's doing all this, your reaction was less, oh, that's hilarious, and more, wait, that's it? That's his motivation? The previous Despicable Me villains have always been a little goofy, but they also had memorable personalities. Vector was hilariously overconfident, El Macho was completely insane, Balthazar Brat had an unforgettable 80s gimmick. Maxime just doesn't have that same presence. Part of the problem is that he's barely even in the movie. He appears in the opening, disappears for most of the runtime, and then suddenly comes back for the first 20 minutes. By the time the third act arrives, it feels like we barely know him. Overall, it isn't defensively bad, it still has moments that make me smile, but it's easily one of the weakest entries in the franchise. The pacing is scattershot, the plot is incredibly thin despite trying to juggle so many storylines, and most of the characters' films are developed because nobody gets enough screen time. Number 5, Minions. I know the Minions have become the bane of a lot of people's existence, but I don't think it's bad as people make it out to be. It's not a masterpiece, and they can become a little exhausting after 90 minutes, but I still think there's quite a bit to enjoy here if you go in expecting a goofy cartoon rather than another straight-up Despicable Me movie. One thing the movie does well is the visual comedy. Since the Minions don't really speak English, the film has to rely heavily on slapstick, facial expressions, and physical humor. When it works really well. One of my favorite jokes involves a mad scientist who has created dozens of clones of himself. One of the clones accidentally kills the original scientist, which causes all the clones to instantly disappear. It's such a dark, unexpected joke that it completely caught me off guard. There is also an extended sequence where the minions end up in a medieval dungeon filled with torture devices. The joke is that none of the traps actually hurt them. Every machine completely fails because the minions are basically indestructible. It's classic Looney Tunes style humor, and it's one of the best scenes in the movie. Sandra Bullock also gives a great performance as Scarlet Overkill. She brings a ton of personality to the role. She feels theatrical, over the top, and genuinely entertaining every time she's on screen. She may not be the deepest villain in the franchise, but she's definitely one of the more fun ones. The biggest issue is simply the movie starts running out of steam. The Minions work best as supporting characters. They're fantastic when they pop in for a quick joke before handing the story back to the main characters. When you have them carry an entire film, it's a much bigger challenge, and there are points where the constant gibberish and slapstick start to feel repetitive. The plot itself is also fairly thin. It's mostly an excuse to move the Minions from one comedic set piece to another, but I still think it gets far more hate than it deserves. It's colorful, energetic, silly, and has enough genuinely funny moments to keep it entertaining. It's not one of Illumination's best, but I also don't think it's anywhere near their worst. Number 4, Despicable Me 2. One of those sequels that improves certain parts of the original, while simultaneously becoming messier at others. The biggest strength is easily Gru's continued character development. Instead of simply repeating the first movie, the sequel explores what his life looks like now that he's retired from being a supervillain. Watching him try to be a full-time father while awkwardly navigating the idea of dating again is a natural next step for his character. Lucy is also an excellent addition. He's energetic, quirky, optimistic, and completely different from Gru, which makes the chemistry work really well. Watching the two bounce off each other provides some of the movie's funniest moments, and by the end, the romance actually feels earned. Honestly, the rest of the movie isn't nearly as focused. The plot keeps jumping between Gru's investigation, Lucy's relationship, El Macho's plans, Agnes trying to find Gru a wife, and the Minions getting kidnapped and mutated. Individually, most of these ideas are perfectly fine. Together, they never quite come together into a satisfying whole picture. The villain is entertaining enough thanks to Benjamin Bratt's performance, but compared to Vector from the first movie or even some of the other villains of the franchise, he's never that memorable. Then there are the Minions. This is really where Illumination started to realize just how popular they'd become. The problem is that the movie leans into them way too much. In the original film, they were used as comic relief that supported Gru's story. Here, they feel like it's basically their movie. The purple evil minions are fun for a while, but the plotline of them starts to wear thin long before the movie ends. That being said, there's still plenty to like. The animation is brighter and more polished than before, the action scenes are bigger, Lucy is a genuinely lovable new character, and Gru's relationship with his daughters continues to provide the emotional heart of the story. It's still a fun family movie, it's just not nearly as tightly written or emotionally satisfying as the original. Number 3, Minions Rise of Gru. It really should be called Despicable Me Rise of Gru, though, because Gru is really the focus. I think how much you enjoy the film really depends on how much you already enjoy the franchise. If you're someone who's already tired of the Minions, it's obviously not going to change your mind, but if you're like me and you enjoy most of the films, I think there's a lot to like. One of the smartest decisions the movie makes is putting young Gru at the center of the story. Unlike the first Minions movie, which struggles because the Minions have to carry the narrative, this film remembers that Gru is ultimately the heart of the franchise. The Minions are still around for plenty of slapstick comedy, but now they're supporting Gru's journey instead of replacing it. Watching a young Gru desperately trying to earn the respect of the world's greatest supervillains is a genuinely fun premise, and Steve Carell's younger version of Gru still captures the charm that made the character so lovable, and the movie fully embraces its 1970s setting. The music, fashion, hairstyles, cars, and overall aesthetic give the film a personality that's different from the other entries. It adds a lot of visual charm and helps the movie stand out, and the humor is exactly what you'd expect. There's plenty of Three Stooges-inspired slapstick, exaggerated cartoon violence, visual gags, and over-the-top action. Not every joke lands, but enough of them do that I find myself laughing pretty consistently. I also enjoy the Vicious Six. Their names are ridiculous puns, each member has their own unique gimmick, and they fit perfectly in the exaggerated comic book world of Despicable Me. And the third act is one of the best parts of the movie. It becomes absolutely insane in the best possible way. It's incredibly creative, visually inventive, and embraces the cartoon logic these movies have always thrived on. As a prequel, it's also packed with fun references to future events and characters that longtime fans will appreciate. The pacing isn't perfect, and there are definitely moments where the Minions still overstay their welcome, but overall, the film feels more confident and focused than the original Minions movie. It's familiar, yes, but it's also funny, creative, colorful, and genuinely entertaining. Number 2, Despicable Me 3. This feels like Illumination actually learned from the mistakes of Despicable Me 2. The biggest improvement is the Minions. They're still present, they're still funny, but this time they don't take over most of the film. Instead, much like the first film, they're used in moderation, allowing Gru and the actual story to remain the focus. That alone makes it feel much more balanced than the second film. The real standout here is Balthazar Brat. He's one of the most creative villains the franchise has ever made. The idea of a washed-up child actor as emotionally frozen in the 80s is hilarious, and every aspect of his character leans into that concept. His music, gadgets, dance moves, clothing, and even his attacks are all built around 80s nostalgia. It's a hilarious idea. But I don't think the movie pushed it quite as far as it could have. Brat steals every scene he's in, but I kept wishing he had even more screen time because he's easily the most entertaining part of the movie. The film also introduces Gru's long-lost twin brother Drew. It's a fun premise, but Steve Carell does a great job of making the two brothers feel distinct, despite being voiced by the same actor. The subplot about Gru rediscovering what kind of person he wants to be after giving up villainy also gives the movie a surprisingly thoughtful emotional core. But not every subplot works. Agnes searching for a real unicorn feels like filler that interrupts the stronger storylines. I wish they devoted that time to Balthazar Brat instead. I did not care about Agnes at all in this movie when they were doing that. Still, the movie looks fantastic. The comedy lands more consistently than the second film, and the pacing is much smoother, and I think it's definitely one of the stronger sequels. It's funny, colorful, and more focused than the predecessors. I just wish it had fully committed to exploring Balthazar Brat, because he had all the ingredients to become the best villain in the entire franchise. And in first place is the original Despicable Me, the best movie in the franchise by a pretty comfortable margin. It's genuinely charming, heartfelt, and it works equally well for kids and adults. Kids get all the goofy gadgets, slapstick comedy, and the Minions. Adults get a surprisingly touching story about redemption, fatherhood, and learning to open your heart. That balance is something the later sequels never quite recaptured. Everything about this movie feels focused. There's one clear story, one emotional arc, everything exists to support it. Gru starts as a selfish supervillain whose only goal is to steal the moon. Adopting 3 girls is just another part of his plan, but over time what begins as manipulation slowly turns into genuine love. Watching him transform from someone incapable of caring about anyone into a devoted father is still one of the strongest character arcs in modern animated films. Steve Carell's performance sells every step of that journey. He's hilarious when the movie gets comedy, he's intimidating, he's acting like a villain, and it's surprisingly vulnerable during the emotional moments. The supporting cast is equally memorable. The girls are lovable and never annoying. Dr. DeFario provides plenty of laughs, and Vector remains one of the funniest villains Illumination ever created. His over-the-top confidence, ridiculous gadgets, and awkward personality make it endlessly entertaining. The humor is another reason the movies age so well, even over 15 years later. Rather than relying on non-stop randomness, most of the jokes grow naturally out of the characters and their personalities. That makes the comedy feel timeless instead of trendy. And when the movie decides to get emotional, it absolutely earns it. Scenes like Gru reading the bedtime story or realizing how much girls truly mean to him still hit because the film took the time to develop those relationships naturally. Even visually, the movie still holds up remarkably well. The stylist character designs give it a unique identity that helps it avoid feeling dated, and the animation remains expressive, energetic, and full of personality. I think this is the film people will still be talking about decades from now. It's funny, heartfelt, beautifully paced, and emotionally satisfying. Not only is it easily the best Despicable Me movie, it's one of Illumination's very best films overall, and it comes in at number 1. So go ahead and share the Despicable Me and Minions movies that you've seen, and I'll see you next time.